Hi class! Today I get to tell you a little bit about one of the experiments covered in the self-justification topic. Now, before I start explaining this experiment, I want to remind you that I created a PowerPoint for you to follow along with. Hopefully it will help you kind of navigate and track with the many components of this experiment. So take a second, pull it up. And I hope you enjoy. Now that you have your PowerPoint pulled up and you're ready to follow along, I am going to share with you a little bit about one of the experiments conducted by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser on the subject of compliance, specifically with the focus on something known as the foot in the door technique. And before we jump into the experiment, let me give you a little bit of information about the foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique is a compliance tactic that involves getting a person to agree to a large request by first setting them up to agree with a moderate or small request. Employing this technique, the two men conducted an experiment to measure the impact of having a first contact with subjects, whether it was at the moment to familiarize them with the material or to request a small agreement from. First, a story was devised from the experimenters in which they would pose as researchers for a household company. All categories and all subjects were contacted by phone, at which time they were told of the experiment, informed of the study taking place, and depending on which group they were then placed in, more or less information would be given. So, the procedure for this experiment included contacting 156 housewives from Palo Alto, California that were randomly chosen from the phone directory. All calls were made by the same experimenter who identified himself and then spoke to his involvement with the California Consumers Group. Random assignment for the 4 condition groups were then given. The 4 condition groups in this experiment included a performance group, an agree-only group, a familiarization group, and a one-contact control group. For the performance group, the initial contact looked like the experimenter calling and giving a general overview of the study at hand, and then following up with 8 follow-up questions to the participant. If the participant was willing, then her answers would then be recorded. Similar to the performance group, with the agree-only group, the initial contact looked like the experimenter calling up, sharing a broad overview again of the study at hand, and then also informing them of the 8 questions that they were wanting to ask. Although compliance for this control group was simply brought down to whether the participant was willing to answer these questions, so a yes or no. If she was willing to answer the questions, then she would be added to a list of willing participants and thanked for her time. And if not, then communication was over and that was it. For the initial contact with the familiarization group, the experimenter introduced himself, described the organization, listed all 8 of the questions he was inquiring about, and further explained the purpose of the experiment to familiarize the subject with the organization. No agreement was sought for answering any of the questions, rather just information provided. And for all the conditions, there were some subjects who did not agree to further contact. Whether compliant or not, all answers were recorded and every subject was contacted a second time. To those whom second contact could not be made, they were discarded from the experiment and their answers were not recorded. So 2 weeks after the initial contact and the small requests were made, the second contact was then made again by phone and again by the same experimenter. At this point, the experimenter told the subject of the growing scope of the experiment and inquired about her willingness to allow 5 to 6 men to come into her house and document and record the household products being used. If there was a willingness and a compliance, the subject would then be thanked for her willingness and told that there would be a follow-up call to arrange a meeting within the next couple of weeks. And if the subject was non-compliant, then she would be thanked for her time and all contact was then ended. Results were then documented from every control group. The results proved to be very much in line with the hypothesis. Subjects who agreed to smaller requests were more likely to comply with larger requests at the later time. Initial contact impacted the willingness of the participant for both the agree-only and the familiarization condition, although it was the performance group that were most willing to comply with the large request. It was documented that 52.8% of the performance group, 33.3% of the agree-only group, 27.8% of the familiarization group, and 22.2% of the one contact only group complied with the large request. Now, there are many hypotheses or beliefs about why initial contact may increase later compliance, some of which may include a feeling of obligation to meet the experimenter's expectations on the subject, a feeling of increased trust. The more you know someone, the more willing you are to trust them and engage with them. Even the idea of consistency breeding willingness. The more that you see something and you realize that it's safe, the more that you realize you can trust it. And also the idea of making it personal. Once you engage with something, as in the subjects engaging with the experiment once, you can adopt a sense of feeling like you have something to contribute and that you would want to further engage with the experiment. Now, there's no doubt that this study draws attention to the idea of the foot in the door technique, the principle of initial contact in which a small request is made and then carried out to later then increase compliance with a second larger request. Yet what remains unanswered by the study alone are the whys and hows of the initial request. What makes it thrive, what makes it successful, and therefore increase the willingness later on. Lucky for you, the next video talks a little bit about this and that subject will be addressed. I hope you enjoy.